go back and start again with this matrix if we could.
Yes, and I'd like to ask Dan Ray and Cindy Messer.
Come back up here, and I wouldn't exactly say I'm grimly determined to get this over by lunch because that would be unfair, but it would be terrific if we could work through this, see where we are, circle around, chew it over, get the public reaction, and finish as soon as we could today.
Maybe our approach should just to be optimistically determined instead of grim, and then we can accept it.
It's an attitude difference, that's all.
Yeah, I wanted to start out maybe by reviewing our conversations yesterday afternoon, in part to make sure we understand your expectations for the next meeting, but also, if we can, to kind of sharpen our focus too, because I am concerned about the amount of staff work we might need to undertake to get ready for that, and the effect it would have on completion of other aspects of our work on the Delta Plan and other things we're trying to deal with now. So maybe the simplest way to address this would be to start with Table 1 again. And what I heard you to say was that you wanted us to bring back two things for where we're proposing or suggesting revisions to the plan in response to comments. And one would be the actual language of the comments that we're responding to and understanding who they are, and you can see what those commenters actually said. And the second would be not just our own suggestion, but how it would be revised, but perhaps some alternatives approaches as well. And I think we can derive some of those from the environmental impact reports alternatives. In some cases, those were suggested by the commenters themselves. But I guess I'd like to, so I want to make sure that that's what you want to see to start with.
Respond on the options. I don't want to have what's in the EIR in that. I want your best thinking of what are the alternative ways that we might meet the objective that might respond to what you think are legitimate comments from all of the stakeholders. It's a thought process. It's not what other people said. It's what you guys think.
Okay.
Because otherwise we have to do it. And it's going to be better given that you live in it all the time to be able to give us optional ways to do it. So we can say, well, I'm more in this direction and let's change it this way. Otherwise, what you do, if I see it and I don't like it, I have to say no. I don't like being I don't like having to push back at you guys because I'm disappointed in what I see, because I think you've picked what one commenter said louder than anybody else. I want you guys are incredibly thoughtful staff. I want your options on the different ways we could go. Just it's basic policy decision making.
Sure.
Okay. I don't want what other people said. I want what you think.
Okay.
Our options.
Don?
No. And I was hoping one way we might approach giving you the language for comments is rather than provide you all the comments that I might have received referring to a policy, we might be able to just give you a range of representative examples of the comments we received. Because we can deliver everything to you if you want, but you're going to get a stack of paper this big.
Let me weigh in. I think Gloria had suggested yesterday during a discussion, whether it was on this section or another, that you wanted to see what the comments were from the organizations that were identified in some of these areas. And I don't know whether this is what you're talking about, Dan, but we have, the 3,000 letters we've gotten since we started in 2010. We have the 5,100 pages of comments under the EIR, and I don't think Gloria meant she wanted to have you duplicate all of those documents, highlighting or underlining the language that's involved. I mean, I don't think she would. Well, there she is right now. We're talking about you. Ms. Gray, we're working back. Dan's working through what we discussed yesterday on the matrix, making sure he has an understanding of what's needed or not needed. Okay. We've just started with the first page of the policies and recommendations comment stuff, and we got into the question of, Dan said, well, do you want to have copies of all the documents that reference the ideas we've identified since 2010, which we've already received, or did you want a distillation of it? And I was speaking for you because you had raised that point, and I said I thought you didn't want to have them copy each and every document from every source.
No.
So, well, why don't you weigh in, and if you would, please.
I think what I asked was kind of look at all the comments that were made, and I think you indicated that there were a lot of comments made on one particular item, and if you can kind of summarize what that is, that item, and then include it in your list of what that item, what the idea was in terms of what the language and so forth, so we could look at that option as one of the options compared to the staff's language. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm hearing is you'd like, right now in the matrix on table 1, we had very briefly summarized the concerns that we heard, and I guess you're wanting a little fuller explication in each of those areas of what the actual language might have been or the proposals that the agency might have offered.
Well, I thought I heard you say that you kind of chose the different themes that you thought were important comments.
Well,
right. And there were some that were not included, but there was a preponderance of comments made on that particular item, but you just didn't include it. I thought that was kind of the question that Felicia asked you.
So this would be, in this case then, just to understand what we would be doing to prepare for next meeting, is we would really be bringing you back even a longer list of issues to review, where that would be a fuller explanation, fuller compilation of the issues on which people offered comments, even if we thought they were the proposals that we were
that you didn't think was that
or
important.
That we didn't think were that controversial.
Right.
Let's, Randy, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, Dan, we've had 6.5 months to review the comments on the 5th draft. They're all posted on the website. We don't need to be spoon-fed that information again. Don't waste your time going through that. We've had 4 months to review the Independent Science Board's reaction to the 5th draft. You don't need to review that for us. We've all read it. We've been working with the Delta Protection Commission on the ESP now for several months. We're aware of what's in there. We're fully aware of their recommendations. So you don't need to review that for us. What's lacking is a summary of the EIR comments. And if the EIR is truly going to inform the process, we need, as I would expect normally occurs, a table listing the general comments and the reaction. Now, it was my understanding yesterday we probably won't get to that for another few months.
That's correct.
Okay. So that's not going to be entirely useful in informing us for the 6th draft. So we basically have received all the information that we're going to get prior to the meeting on the 29th and 30th. So what I would ask for, and I may be the minority opinion in this, but I would ask for staff to tell us, what are you troubled by? What are the issues that you're hearing conflicting input from the council, and the uncertainties that exist within the staff about how to address a particular issue. Bring it up with options and let us react to that on the 29th and 30th to give you clear direction, even if it comes to a vote of the council, is that, no, we want this option, not that option, so that you can sit down and hammer out the 6th draft with a pretty clear and confident feeling about what the council is seeking. That's the process that I would like to see occur over the next 2 weeks. When you tell me you're concerned about staff time having to go through and collate all this stuff, heaven's sakes, we're all adults. We've had, in some cases, more than 6 months to review this stuff. So don't waste your time on that, please.
Our lawyer leaned forward, grabbed the microphone, and then sat back. What am I to interpret from that, Mr. Stevens?
Only a positive comment, a reaction to what Randy said. I appreciate the fact that we do have limited staff that are working as hard as they can, and we really should focus on what you guys need to make the decision that you need to make. So I appreciate that direction.
Yeah, I should probably, I'm sorry, Gloria.
I want to make sure that you understood what I said, because I agree with Randy. I'm not asking for any additional information that requires you to go back through everything, but I thought you heard yesterday, and maybe you can clarify that, is that how did you select the comment themes that you put in the process report?
Those were identified by the authors of the various chapters in consultation with Cindy and Joe and I as those that were the most troublesome in terms of our sense of
Your sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
not being clear, not wanting to make sure we were headed down a path that y'all
Right.
thought was a positive.
And that was based on the issues and the comments that you received from folks, correct?
Yeah, the conversations
right.
that we've had with stakeholders over
Right.
the last months.
Yeah, but I also thought I heard you say that there was some that were maybe not that important, but you got a lot of comments on them, and you just didn't include them. Those are the things that I was talking about.
We had what we brought here was winnowed down from a list of how many?
91.
91. So
91.
we could go back and bring you that full list of 91. And
how
we could
many
do that
are in
either
the-
as an information item
32.
or as a
Yeah, I would say information, because I just want to kind of, if it's something you already have, it's just kind of information, get a feel, a tone for where people are, some of the issues that may not be that important, but it was important enough for a lot of people to comment on. It may not be a very significant issue, but at least we have the
Yeah.
information. You already have it.
And many of those we as staff agree with, and we have some ideas for changes, but they wouldn't necessarily result in significant changes
Right.
between the fifth and
Right,
sixth.
right.
It might be more narrative, text, more clarification.
And that may be more informational rather than
Yes.
process driven, because I agree with Randy. And the point that he made, I think, is very significant for all of us, is to really kind of figure out why people are concerned about those issues that you've indicated. I think that will help us kind of put things in context, too. So, but again, I'm not asking you to go back and review all of this stuff.
Thank you.
I'm just saying it kind of would be informational on minor stuff. And it kind of goes back to that model of when we had the work sessions and really key issues, but there are some things that we could agree on that may not be as significant as the issue, but we did agree on them, and sometimes it helps folks kind of look at the tone of the plan and say, okay, at least you're working with us. And so that was the reason why I thought that could provide some just information in terms of context. Thank you.
I just want to add my own thoughts on this. I have not read all the environmental impact report comments, all 5,100 pages, but I have gone through and read 4 or 5 or 6 substantial ones. And there were technical comments raised in all of those that seemed directed at the environmental impact report. And then a good number of them are repeating everything they've said on all the previous comments on the Delta Plan. And many of the submissions incorporated by reference all of their previous comments. And I understand that's what happens when you get an environmental impact report. So I don't know, Chris, maybe you might respond to this, but I'm interested in identifying major thematics in this document, and then when you get to the environmental impact thematics, I would be shocked if there were fundamental different points of view raised in the EIR. I saw none. I saw important points raised, but these are what we've been hearing all along in one form or another from all of the interested parties. And so I just want to make sure I understand the legal examination of the EIR information.
Absolutely, and as I said yesterday, the actual formal responses to comments, as well as the comments, are going to be contained in what's called a final EIR. And as Randy pointed out, it's not done yet. I mean, we're still going through the comments. But you're absolutely correct. And in fact, I had mentioned to you briefly that the CEQA team had provided, unfortunately it didn't show up in the staff report for some reason, but we had provided a list of maybe 6 or 7 major thematics of things that we saw in the EIR. And you could categorize them. Obviously, this wasn't the final response to comments, but you could categorize them into maybe 5 or 6 groupings. One grouping was real technical stuff, and another grouping had to do with, we don't like your plan. Your plan isn't a plan. Well, we've heard that in the substantive comments on the 5th staff draft, and so they were kind of incorporated through the EIR again. If your plan isn't a plan, the environmental study you do on the non-plan isn't an environmental study. Those kinds of comments we saw a lot of. So there were groupings, and we'll try to make sure that we have that before you make any decisions and final direction at the next meeting. We'll try to give you the information that you need to get. We understand that it's a bit awkward because we're working around the clock too to go through stacks of comments, but we have been able to categorize them. And I think they'll be informative.
Right.
And as Phil points out, they're not going to come as a shock to you. You've heard it before.
The other things, and it just flashed through my mind. We've gotten a couple of these background documents before, but about a month and a half ago or something like that, Bob Twist and John Curlin came and gave a presentation on how the Delta plan has changed over the 5 iterations, and that was frankly interesting because it didn't argue the policy. It just summarized the changes, and we're dropping the number of regulations and all that kind of stuff. That's context for this discussion. This large EIR issue is context for the discussion. And these matrix, I think Randy accurately summarized the matrix is kind of issues troublesome to staff for a host of reasons where they think that perhaps asking us for some clarification would be appropriate. Yeah. Okay. So, Dan,
that gets to one of my points. The other thing I was going to ask if we could brief. I had the sense yesterday that there were some areas that the council wanted to see a range of choices and was quite interested, and others where you just kind of checked off and you were comfortable with the direction that we were proposing. And I wanted to go back through and see if it's possible to highlight those areas that you're especially interested in. If that would be, I have a suggestion about that, and if that would be.
I'm for going ahead before we go back.
Going ahead before we go back. Okay.
Our concern is that we may lose some council members as the day goes on, and so at the end of the day, we'd be getting feedback from a smaller group of people in terms of reviewing the work we did yesterday. I think this will just take like 5 minutes, maybe less.
Randy.
How about this? Unless the council member suggests that we drop something from this matrix, leave everything on here, and in preparation for the 29th and 30th, as you feel led, offer a couple or 3 alternatives for those recommendations and those policies based on what you've heard. And,
that works for us as long as it will work for council members.
Well, the council reserves the right to say, yes, it works for us, and then change our mind at the next meeting, as you know. But
we want to be helpful, but so if you want to see that across the board, we'll do our best. It's going to slow our work down. I think that's what
we skimmed over a bunch of things yesterday, and that is a reasonably clear sign that those items are probably resolved. I'll give you an example. The notion, your suggestion, do we need to emphasize the coordination of activities? And Gloria spoke about that, and I think Felicia, you spoke about that too.
I've been ranting about it for months.
And nobody objected to it. We don't have a language. We don't know what you're going to propose, but I don't think that requires you coming back with anything more than either if you have language you want us to consider, we do it. If you have concepts to consider, we do it. And that would just amplify what's here as opposed to writing the Delta Plan 6 draft in its definitive form, which you are not proposing to do and we are not proposing. I would think, however, if you are changing the language of policies or regulatory stuff, that might be worth a careful wording of the language. And for some of the recommendations that in your judgment are significant enough, that might warrant more language. And I don't know, Chris, is that the right way to, from a legal viewpoint, to approach it? Mr. Stevens nods his head.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I just use your best judgment. I wouldn't take silence as assent because we knew we weren't making decisions. So, but if you took notes on everything we said yesterday, you'll know the nuances of what we had questions about. And if we didn't raise questions about it all, don't assume that means it was fine, but just use your best judgment based on everything we've indicated and what you know out in the broader world. I mean, Because the whole point of this is for us to be able to give you input so you can have a more advanced awareness of what we're thinking as you do the sixth draft, with the whole point of you asking us. So
Yeah.
just, it's one of those things, this is such a huge task, and I am completely aware of how hard your staff is working. But you just put on the hat that it's a big part of our job, too, to be able to give you input, and we haven't been able to for a while, other than if we do it on our own and we do it in a vacuum. So for us, this is a really good exercise. So, sort of more is better, but not to the point of just churning out work. So use your best judgment.
Excuse me.
Mr. Chair.
Gloria.
Yeah, I think you heard a lot from different council members, however, I think that it's important that you come back with something, the language that's what you think, what staff thinks should be in those areas that you have before us, the comment themes, the exact language that staff thinks should be there. But I also wanted to see the language that the other folks thought should be there. So if you have an area where there is language from some of the stakeholders, put that language there so we can have that as an option, so that when we look at the document, we can actually say, yes, we agree with staff language, or yes, we agree with whomever language it is, so that we can actually make some decisions. But it's important that we see the options. I think someone used the word options. This is the overriding language that we receive from whomever, and this is what they think. This is the language that staff feels should be. And then the council can vote it up or down, whatever we decide. Because if we don't, we'll keep kind of talking about it and never get to the point where we agree to it. So where you can put exact language, I think you should do that. Staff's language and stakeholder language. These are our options. This is what they believe, and this is what we believe. And let the council decide on it. And I think it's important about what Randy said. Why is this so important to folks out there? So we can compare all of that. Okay. And we can make some decisions on these, especially the critical areas. The other areas is not that significant, but we can deal with it. But I think we need to get to the part in the process where we actually make a decision, so that when you do the last draft, 6, 7, you actually know what the council is agreeing on. This is our language.
Yeah. And in some cases, that will drive us back into the EIR alternatives, because many of the comments were, hey, we like what we gave you to use in the draft EIR.
Right, and it won't be very different as
and we should be able to
Don, then Felicia.
Yeah, I was just picking up on the point that Gloria was making. My past experience with, kind of this voluminous material with all the various aspects that go with that, and many commenters, is not unlike what you bring to us today with this matrix, but maybe another matrix that kind of has, at least in those categorical areas and these key critical elements, either suggested, take it out altogether, here's some modified language, or where there's agreement around it. Certainly staff's going to bring us their best take, but I'll just use an example just to kind of highlight this. When we did our housing element some years ago, we had 3 or 4 major stakeholder groups, that probably more here stakeholder groups, but that were involved. And those matrices, from a decision maker standpoint, were very helpful, because again, you had them in boxes. It wasn't, we could go back and pull letters and look at the full text, and sometimes it was, many, many pages. But it gave you an idea of kind of the range, everything from leaving it in as whatever the most current staff draft was, to modifications based upon input from groups that were key interests in the housing side, advocates, those who are from the building industry, those who might be from from a neighborhood standpoint. And again, it takes time to put it together, but if you're going to get down to actually getting direction and honing in on the language, and this may be too big of a task between now and 2 weeks from now, but maybe a portion of what we have here, and then we do this in some bites. But that was very, very useful in helping us make decisions, because you had the language before you had the essence of all the things, documentation, and that's what Randy's point is. We've read a lot of that, but so again, it may be difficult trying to figure out, well, are we going to use the ag urban, or are you going to use the the economic sustainability plan? Are you going to use, power, water users, whatever it might be? But bring that together, and I think you've got some categories of similar comments. How you might either structure language, if it wasn't specific language, I think that would be very, very useful. And again, it takes time to do that, but I know that it's helped certainly in my role as member of Board of Supervisors in different settings, and even at the Delta Protection Commission some years ago, we used that matrix, and we actually had specific language. Well, Dan, you sat through the exercise. It wasn't as monumental as this, but nonetheless, where we were hours at it, but we were able to get to decision points and actually get to to specific language. And it took a while, but you could, portray it. Everybody had what was before them, and they knew the kind of the range from leaving it in as it was currently before us to taking it out and everything in between. So I would just...
So can I summarize where I think we're at so we can move on? Not yet.
Felicia?
Two things. One, I appreciated what Don had to say. To reemphasize that point, I have 2 points. One is, this is a deliberative body. Your task here is to help us be deliberative in a way that helps you. So talking about what the different parties said on a tough issue, because there are disagreements among parties on this. You don't have to get it into the minutia, into what you have to do in the comments, be able to say, because this is kind of a summary, and it sounds like it's what one group said, and I know that there are groups that disagree. It'd be helpful to have said, on the one hand, some people think this, on the other hand, people think that, and then give us, I don't want just one option on what you want. I want you to give us multiple options to help us figure out a way to do it. Now, if it's not, use your judgment on it, but that's how I've always seen public policy deliberative it's what I always made my staff do internally when I was actually in a government role, so I could see the value of their thinking. I got to make the decision, but I really wanted to see the alternatives that they had looked for. I mean, I come out of the Harry Saradarian options school, and it's a really important way to show that you have actually thought through what the issues are. It gives you a grounding and an ability actually to rely more heavily on the expert staff and their thinking than just giving us a thing we have to react to, yes or no. And so that's, I think, where Gloria's point and where Don's point about being able to see what the issues are in a slightly more sophisticated manner will help us give you input. The second thing is important, and I just was mentioning this to Gloria, you need to give us options so we can give you feedback. We are not going to make decisions until after we've seen this EIR and the response to comments. We've been really clear on that all the way through, and I reserve the right to give you feedback and then look at it when I see it and change my mind, because that is the way this process works. So we will not be making a decision until the 7th draft on anything. But we can give you better guidance in the short run if you give us all this.
And that's our goal.
Yes.
Did I do well, Chris?
That was good. All right, Joe, wrap this up in 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah, and let us know who made the comments. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what I understand is that for those issues where we think there is still significant issues that we need to resolve, you want a broader spreadsheet, if you will, that shows different alternatives, sources of where the kinds of language and thought processes came from, and then alternatives so we can have a broader discussion based on more facts that are all on one sheet of paper for each one of those major issues. So, and it may be out of these 20 that we have here, 10 of them require that kind of documentation.
Okay. Now, Mr. Ray, in that light, do we need to go through what we went through yesterday?
I think we're probably got good direction then, and we can proceed.
Okay. Then let us turn to page 9 of the first matrix with the reference to a risk reduction policy 4, priorities for state investment in Delta levies. And there are, 5 or 6 items that are contained. 5 items, 6 items that are contained. Start with an overview before you get into each detailed item. What approach are you recommending to the council on the prioritization for levy investments, which is mostly a Chapter 7, not exclusively, but mostly?
Right, and so I'll go ahead and start off with this. So for policy RRP4, the prioritization framework, what we've done, it really is line items 15 and 16 that address the comments that we received on that particular policy. And to summarize, the policy was the idea of developing a framework for prioritization of state investments in Delta levees. And the first set of comments that we summarized and put in here on line item number 15 had to do with concerns or recommendations to us, to the council, that the council itself develop the prioritization framework as opposed to the Department of Water Resources. So what
this is pursuant to the statutory direction to us to recommend to the legislature an investment strategy in this area. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So what we've really done is kind of highlighted in item number 15 who will be developing the framework. I know yesterday's discussion led to a discussion of the dates as well. In our matrix here, we didn't address the dates at that point. Obviously, the discussion will go where it needs to. But what staff recommended or is proposing is revising the policy language for this RRP4 to indicate that the council will develop the framework.
And of course, one of the alternative proposals was from the Delta Protection Commission that we should set a priority now, and that would be all that would be brought up to PL 8499 standard.
Don.
Yeah, if I could, just as you bring this back, I would offer a thought that, and maybe in crafting this, and certainly this will be up to the council's discretion and determination only, but that in light of what's come forward from the commission, that there may be a way here to meld that, and that in working with the commission, we've done, it's not just we just did a plan and that's the end of the relationship between the stewardship council and the commission. This may be a key area where ongoing in the years to come, and one developing the framework, but also in working through that. I think this is an area that where we can build some very strong relationships beyond what's in statute, between the commission and its role, and certainly this council and its role. And I would suggest that some thought be given to that, and maybe in framing some language, and again, for at least for our consideration.
Randy.
If I understand what you said correctly, then the policy change would be one of almost a recommendation for a process that would occur after the Delta plan is adopted?
Yeah, our current policy says that asked is a recommendation. I think that, and Eric's here, I should probably get up here, but my understanding of it is that it's essentially a recommendation that the Department of Water Resources should develop an updated set of priorities that would be based on an island-by-island analysis of the economics, considering a variety of factors that contribute to the value of each island, and that until that had been completed, we would use the existing standards that the department is operating under to make decisions about levy priorities. Now, the alternative would be the proposal we have from DPC that says all islands should be brought up to PL 8499 with additional protection for legacy communities in those areas.
Mr. Chairman, going back to the conversation we had yesterday, I think it really is the duty and the obligation of this council to come up with recommendations. And I'm going to ask Joe to come up with an exhaustive list of considerations that one would use to rank the islands in order of importance. And I'm not limiting that just to economic importance. Give that list to me. I'll take out the ones that I think are appropriate and then weight them. Some considerations will have more value and influence than others, and then I'll pass it around to people and we'll talk about it and use it as a recommendation. It galls me to wait a couple of years for another agency to do that. And if we're responsible for the Delta water, then I think it behooves us to initiate it. Whether it's going to be accepted as a policy or recommendation, we'll see. But it's certainly an important task for this council to do, and I think we should start on it without any delay.
Yeah.
And by the next meeting, I'll have at least my list of the considerations that I think are important, and I'll have it weighted.
Yeah, and we can do that relatively easily because really the current draft policy that we have on page 178 of the plan lists a set of criteria that we did think were important for that evaluation, and the substantive change that we've suggested in
I just
these
want to make
response
sure
was
that we haven't left anything off.
Okay.
And I want to make sure it is exhaustive.
Okay.
Okay. Let me just weigh in. I like the approach of the council starting its work in 2013, and I think this is your timetable, and by the end of 2013, we will adopt levy standards to recommend to the legislature for investment purposes.
Priorities, I think, for investment purposes.
Prioritization. Yeah. Okay. Now, I should probably tell you, here is my current thinking on, after listening now for 6 straight years on levy discussions. California has no levy investment strategy. We have instead separate funding streams that have been approved by the legislature or the voters in bonds that become the surrogate for a policy because we want to help people. We have no consistent understanding of cost-sharing ratios. We do not apply the funding streams or the cost-sharing ratios in any standardized way throughout California. And all of the politics surrounding this issue and all of the agency's difficulties in complying with it relate fundamentally to the fact that there are deep conflicts between interests over who pays, how much, and for what. And it should not surprise any of us that state government has, to date, and the federal government as well, not been wildly clear about that. On the other hand, I don't think the Delta Stewardship Council, with 53 staff and all the things we're going to do, is capable of replacing the Department of Water Resources, the emergency management agencies, or all the others, the federal agencies that do this. This may not be the right analogy, but I think it's close. In the 1960s, the legislature adopted the Master Plan for Higher Education. And they set in statutory goals the notion that if I remember the thematics correctly, that if you graduated in the upper 10% of your high school class, you were eligible to go to the University of California. If you graduated in the upper 15%, I think it was, you could go to CSUS. And for everyone else, the community colleges were to be available. Now, these are for willing, voluntary students. That was deeply contentious when it came up for people who said, no, everybody has to go to the University of California, and all the other stuff. But it was the closest thing to a clear policy. And it exists in some form now, today, over 50 years later. I think the council needs those kinds of near statutory declarations for priority setting more than the precise details. I believe an island-by-island examination to identify state interest is fully consistent with our statutory mandate. I like that approach. But the statute does not provide guidance on cost sharing from those implications. The statute does not provide guidance on whether state agencies with responsibility for infrastructure in the Delta have an obligation to spend their money to protect the infrastructure. And I know for certain that Caltrans is not interested in spending any highway money to protect the highways from the risk of flooding. An odd position, but I guess understandable. And I also know that the local interests have a very clear position on funding. The Kutras formula of funding, the 99 state dollars for every one local dollar, was said in semi-jest, but not much, because that is the clear thing. That's what I want this process to be, is leading us to public policy recommendations as to strategy and levy standards. Which means we have to address the land use complications in the process. We have to stop this notion of saying, well, let's go to this level because it's a good idea. There has to be a rationale to doing it. I like your approach a lot. I'd want to see the language. I do think that this is a very, very complicated and difficult job. Not quite as difficult as the Delta Plan, but close. And you're going to need staff help and planning to start organizing it now rather than waiting until we complete the Delta Plan. Fortunately, we have, consultants who might be available. I mean,
how would you incorporate what Randy raised, which is the defensive posture of the state with respect to risk if there is flooding?
Well, if the emergency, you've got the emergency response stuff, but if you want to do the prophylactic levee work that gives protection, the question, I suppose, is...
Well, I meant, are we increasing or reducing our liability? And
for the state, you mean?
Yeah, and how we set priorities. Is it affecting that?
Hopefully during this process, we actually haul in lawyers who will talk to us in public on this subject. Most of the agency lawyers would prefer not to. I personally think the state is backing into a paternal-like responsibility by all these things we do for good motives, in spite of all the language, including language in our enabling statute, that is designed to avoid that liability. After a while, when you do planning in an area at such an extent and you have funding involvement, it's hard to imagine you haven't swallowed risk for legal exposure. And Pat, I don't know what to do about it. I think that is one of the... It's not quite as bad as the unfunded pension liabilities of government agencies, but these are big dollars we're talking about. These are not minor dollars. These are giant dollars. And the state of California should not indirectly walk into a multi-billion-dollar drain on the general fund because we didn't think about the questions in front. If they want to go do it consciously and deliberately, they should do it consciously and deliberately. But I don't know. I don't have a better answer than that. But this process is really helpful, but it can't just be the Department of Water resource process of let's see what every island wants and then taking the funding that's available and parceling it out in a way that gets... there's no policy out of that. That's just ad hoc. And I guess one alternative is saying, it's all screwed up and it's going to stay screwed up and that's just the way it is. That is one policy option, I suppose. Sorry. Hank.
Joe, while you're out, I'd like to ask you to come up with an exhaustive list of all the considerations that could be used for ranking the islands in order of importance. On that exhaustive list, everything, the tsetse fly population on an island, if that's important to some people, put it down. So you can come up with that exhaustive list of all the considerations used in ranking islands in order of importance, forgetting about funding and everything else. Give that to me, and I'll tick off the ones that I think are important, and I'll weight them.
Well, there actually are
Can you
some
do that?
extant lists
actually,
around.
There are lists, and we have a staff been thinking about in the next draft plan that we actually, and there was some in the fifth draft, we want to enhance the list and say these are the main factors that staff believes.
For me, I'm asking as a member of the council, can you do that? An exhaustive list, everything that comes to mind from anybody on your staff.
I can do that, and I'm looking at Eric, who will have to really do it. But
When do you think Eric can get it done?
We'll talk during lunch. I need to consult with him about
What do you think, Eric?
Mr. Nickel, use the microphone up front, please.
Well, I would add that we have been working on the broad categories, so I would say roughly there's about 8 or 9 categories that I think capture a lot of the real high-level things like critical infrastructure, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And obviously within a category like that, there's going to be a lot of subcategories and sub-subcategories. And I would add that I think some of the folks that are working on the Central Valley Flood Plan, as well as some other DWR staff, and I saw a partial listing yesterday, are actually going through and trying to list down to a very, perhaps not at the tsetse fly level, but maybe a few levels above, trying to go out and list all of these different items out as best they can. Mm-hmm. So, for example, critical infrastructure might include schools and hospitals, and within schools there might be subcategories. Within healthcare facilities there might be subcategories. Within roads there are subcategories. Mm-hmm. But they're attempting to actually go and conduct this very type of inventory I think you're referring to. So I think as best we can, in a very short order, perhaps within a week or two, we could probably come up with our understanding of the listing and inventory that's available, and then it probably will highlight and facilitate additional discussion.
This is a moving target, but just do the best you can in about a week. And so by the next meeting, by that Friday, I'll be back up Thursday night. Well, we can discuss it.
I think that makes sense. We've already got Appendix H in the draft Delta plan, which is the DWR framework document on this subject, which is referenced in the Delta plan. We've got the Central Valley Flood Plan, which does have itemizations of both categories and component. I can't remember what they call it, but important elements that they're. That's a start.
In order to do the right kind of analysis.
And we've got the DPC listing, which is also has a listing of components, many of which are comparable to the other lists as well.
Yeah, just come up with a list, and I'm sure, based on what we know, you're going to have 98% of everything that we could list, if not 99%.
It'll be covered in one category or another. It's just how much of the detail will be there. And that's something we're going to have to really lay out as we move ahead with this plan, because nobody's really done all of that work before.
Well, for my purposes, you don't need all the detail. For my purposes, timing and action and getting something done or a discussion initiated is more important than perfection.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, just
Gloria.
Yeah, I think Hank is right in terms of trying to get a format where we can make a decision, but I want clarification. Are we making policy statements, recommendations, or whatever as it relates to what areas considerations should be prioritized? Or are we actually selecting islands?
We're statutorily directed to develop recommendations on a prioritization to present to policymakers.
Prioritization as it relates to what areas, what considerations should be first when you look at an island. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's
the island.
By implication, that's what the staff is suggesting be done. The island by island consideration be part of it. But the Delta plan itself has components that are inherently part of this, and risk reduction, the reduction of risk in the Delta to people, property, and state interest, as defined in statute, is really the one that drives this discussion.
Right.
It's not just the prioritization, it's the fact that we're told that has to be part of the Delta plan. That's what Chapter 7 is all about in the draft.
But are we
Delta.
actually looking at islands to fit into those prioritization?
Yeah, but they're suggesting not for inclusion in the Delta plan. The Delta plan will set up our process, and the change, as Randy pointed out, is rather than waiting and hoping that DWR was going to complete something, the staff is proposing that we start our own process to make those recommendations on funding.
Yeah, I don't know how that thing will come out. You might have 3 different groups of islands, an A, a B, and a C, and if some of the assets exceed a total amount of X dollars, it would be in an A group, B group, or a C group. The number of people, the strategic importance in terms of flow rates, protection to other islands would obviously be a consideration.
Yeah.
But I think it would be a useful exercise for us to sit down and tackle the problem and come up with a recommendation as a group.
Some of the discussion yesterday on the FAT levies that was part of the Delta Protection Commission recommendation is one of the subset issues you're going to consider after you decide which islands might satisfy a state interest, assuming you don't decide that all of them do.
But
the
it
design
would be independent of funding. It would just be in isolation. And you have to do that. If California were solvent and had all the money that it needed, we wouldn't need to prioritize. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And when you have a limited amount of funds and a lot of opportunities to spend that fund, you've got to prioritize. And you have to have logical criteria that's been discussed and understood, if not agreed upon.
And I want to point out the legislation, our prioritization is about funding, we assume, from the state. So if someone owns an island or owns land on an island and they want to spend their own money to protect that island, I think the council and staff would probably agree that that's fine. Spend that money to protect the island. It's not that the council's going to say you can't
We haven't reached that point yet.
No. What
Still
what
a
we're
free
talking about
society.
is the prioritization of state investments in the levy program.
But I think when we do identify priorities, and this has, I think, been the underlying tension and certainly part of what I perceive to be the recommendations from the Protection Commission, as priorities are set, the implications, it doesn't take long to figure them out. And so already, we can look at proposals from the Public Policy Institute where they said, hey, we think these are the priorities, and they very quickly could say, oh, here's a dozen islands that we think should be low priorities for protection. And particularly people who live in the Delta and work and live on those properties, they see that and they understand what it means. So we shouldn't imagine that by identifying the criteria we think should be used in priorities that we won't be making decisions that affect the safety of some islands. That's certainly the reality, and that's why folks have been reluctant to do it so far.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's being done now. There are criteria being used to fix levees. They're just not understood.
Yeah.
Okay. Gloria, I'm sorry.
Have we made some decision of
It's part of the, as I assume what you're asking us to do, set up a process for prioritization. We still have to vote on whether we wish to do anything else in the interim.
Yeah, and then they work both ways. I mean, the standards are both partly about providing a degree of safety, but really like the HMP standard is one of the things it does is it makes sure that we're still eligible for federal disaster assistance if islands do flood. So if we were to say a priority wasn't to have all islands come up to HMP, we would be essentially saying, well, if there should be a flood, we don't care if you get federal disaster assistance.
Yeah, that's all stuff down the road.
Yeah.
Don.
Yeah, I just appreciate certainly Dan's comments most recently here, because I think that does go to the heart of it. One of it is that you prioritize then recognizing their resources are limited, that it sends a message beyond just a priority list. I think that people draw from that hey, it doesn't matter over here because we were so far down the list that in the priorities are going to be in a way that you're never going to get to us before something bad happens. The other thing that was pointed out yesterday, I think it's an important point of reference as you look at this list, is that even with a limited contribution from the landowners, in most cases, you require a match of some sort to do this. And so the ability for those on those islands and those areas that are protected to either assess themselves or find other ways to match, that's part of it. And then also getting the work done, getting the permits. I mean, there's some limitations here. Even if you prioritize in one manner or another, you still have all those hurdles. And I mean, they become part of the reality of if you want to do something, because I think we've heard expressions before this council on many occasions, people are ready and willing to go, and there's probably as much work going on right now as there's been in any time in recent years, but there's some limitations because of those who perform the work, the ability to get the permits to do their work, the seasonal timing, all the restrictions and constraints that go into that, even if money weren't an object, which it is. And so I just, again, as we move forward on this, I think that the one point that I wanted to again highlight that Dan just made, though, is that being eligible for federal disaster assistance, I think, is a key piece, because if you do have something of a tragic nature that occurs, that you're able to then hopefully have some resources to call upon to flood fight, but also to respond to repairs if that's the choices that are made after something happens. So I just think it's really important. There's a lot of moving parts here beyond just the list of prioritizing, and I think we need to keep those things in mind as well.
But none of those moving parts are reasons not to come up with a list, are they? That's just something we'll have to grapple with down the road.
We will, but I think that, I certainly want to reserve some judgment on that, Hank, until we see, one, there's a lot of criteria out there, and we do make choices. I don't disagree with that, but I will just say that I think that from the Commission's perspective, and I'll speak on behalf of the Commission's recommendation, is that, again, we look at it from a system approach, recognizing that you can't fix everything all at one time, but that it is a system, and that, the choice that was made by the Commission is that we ought to certainly get to the HMP standard, but look to the PL 8499 and recognize there may be even some more investment because of areas that have a heavier population or more critical infrastructure. That goes to part of your point. But I think if you just direct resources to your top 10 or your top 20 over here and don't put in the investment to help bring up other islands even more modestly, that I think over time that becomes a potential big problem, because you may fortify your top 20, and then the rest of your system continues to degrade because you don't have the resources to put into it. So we need to be cognizant of that, I think.
Well, that would be a function of the amount of funds that are available.
Well, in part, but I think it's also part of your priority list, Hank.
No, I think it entirely. If you get all the funds available, then you can fix all the islands. And I don't think we can determine how much funding there is. That's up to the people of California. They have to make those choices.
Pat.
This is a fundamentally, I think, different approach from that articulated by Tom Zuckerman, and I think referenced by what Don's saying. As I understand it, the in-delta interests use the term systematic to mean we all improve together, perhaps not exactly at the same rate with the same amount of money to the same level, but we consider the Delta Islands as in need of protection in all areas and virtually all islands. The direction that we've talked about, and I think Hank has most strongly articulated, is the need to prioritize based on state interests. And that can be complex, and that can involve a lot of considerations, but then apply the money in what Tom Zuckerman would refer to as top-down as opposed to bottom-up. So bottom-up, I think, was referred to by Phil as an ad hoc approach to DWR, changing priorities as it sees the needs, as it described yesterday. Sometimes arguably for good reasons, but also inevitably because there is no prioritization and there may be little or no policy as to what ought to get funded. So this discussion actually is quite significant because it lays the groundwork for whether the Delta Plan will call for a policy that inevitably has a prioritization and may be capable of compromise with the interests of covering many of the other islands, other levees that Don referred to that aren't in the top 10. But we are going in a direction here today if we go as articulated by Hank, and it's a different direction, I think, if we go in the direction that Tom Zuckerman articulated. I think Don's looking for some combination of approaches, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's a shame that Tom's not here. Maybe he's out with Peter and Richard and the other scientists. But I did talk with Tom and Dave and Mike yesterday, and I think you're right on a systemic approach. It is looking at the Delta as a whole and looking at the importance that one island has because of its position in relation to another island, and if that island goes, and the amount of flow is going to increase and put greater stress on the levees. I think we're all in sync with that, and that would be one of the considerations. The strategic position of an island would certainly be a consideration. In terms of the top-down, bottom-up, I guess I'm just used to top-down. Take the most important and give them the funds in a situation with limited funds rather than the bottom one and work up. But that's something that the council is going to have to decide on as a group.
Yeah, I would
Felicia.
also add we can make recommendations about what the state ought to fund. I mean, we haven't really focused on the finance plan yet because we don't have the plan yet. but there's a judgment we can make. We can make a recommendation. We can't make the funding appear. But it's not that we're total. We can say you ought to fund
and
it if we wanted to.
Recall, too, that a reason that the actions are subject to the consistency requirement of the Act is because they involve state funding. It's not, at least in my view, that's in part to give the council the ability to coordinate funding and make sure it is spent on priority things. So should you set priorities for funding, it's conceivable that if someone were to go ahead and say, no, we're going to put state money into this thing that is a very low priority in the way you've said it, you might find it here before you on appeal.
Well, and just to put a clarifying point, it's clear, at least in the legislative analyses of the bill that established the Delta Plan in this body, that was the idea, that you were supposed to come up with a prioritization, and then together with the consistency review process, it would be an enforcement mechanism to make sure that state funding did go towards that priority, or else it would be inconsistent with the Delta Plan and it wouldn't go forward. So this was, we've talked subsequent to that with some of the members, at least at the staff level, that were involved in drafting this, that really focused and pointed out the difficulties that the legislature has had historically with setting priorities, as well as with DWR and the Flood Board. And they said, this is a tough job. We recognize this, but this is your job.
Randy, then Pat, then Don. Excuse me.
I think what may be obvious but has been unstated to this point is that the reclamation districts and those that are responsible for the levies on individual islands have done great work with the resources that are available to them. What's lacking is a Delta-wide levy plan. There's no integration. And that's what leads to the maps that we have showing some that need a lot of work and some that don't need too much. So I think to the degree that we can help develop a Delta-wide levy plan, it's going to help move things forward in the Delta by huge steps. But what I fear when we have these discussions is that the in-Delta folks feel offended that we're criticizing the work that has gone on. And I don't think that's what's being said here. I think there's great work that's going on. There just lacks a comprehensive plan from a statewide interest perspective that a lot of people, including the legislature, have asked for.
Don.
Yeah, just real quickly, I appreciate Randy's comments, and certainly the discussion, I think, is very useful here today. But I guess I would just maybe summarize that. I think recognizing there certainly are inequities, both in funding, but certainly even in the status of the levies. But I think the approach, again, going back to the commission's deliberations, but I think capturing some of the sense of it here today is that, yes, you have things that have a greater need to be protected, and recognizing, obviously, life being at the top of that list, and certainly population centers, and then property, and as you said, state interests, certainly in the statute. But I think the approach that I would hope that we would keep some sense about as we're looking at this is that trying to have folks rise together rather than just to, as I said, pick the top and then, they're going to get to this and they're going to be rock solid, and down here you've kind of limp along as to, and that was the approach that the commission in looking to go to the PL 8499. Recognize you will still have other choices that are made into the comments here, that you may have FEMA levies and or 200-year protection around population centers, and that's going to be the standard, and people either accomplish that or not, but that you bring this up together and that you take that system approach, and you can't do it all at one time. I mean, that's a recognition. And so hopefully as we look at this, we can keep that thought in mind.
Yeah, well, that's certainly an option for the council. Have all the islands come up and comply with PL 8499 before applying the priorities.
Okay. I think you probably want to zip through a couple of the little subparagraphs.
Did you say zip,
to make sure,
like in quick and efficient and fast and speedy?
Well, it feels like we've dealt with what were items 15 and 16 on page 9. So I think now we can talk about item 17,
which is designated floodways in the Delta. It should have its own blue line.
I got it that items 15 and 16 on page 9 have been encompassed by our previous discussion. You now
Right.
want to start with item 17?
Yes, which is designated floodways in the Delta, which should be the,
Existing floodways. The Delta Stewardship Council should consider the expansion to Delta floodways, not do Delta floodways, to accommodate flood flow and climate change.
And of course, designated floodways they're not the entire floodplain. They're regulatory areas that are approved by the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, within which they then get authority to review encroachments. And they've been, in the past, relatively conservative about how they've used those authorities, so that in general the designated floodways in the valley are only within the boundaries of the Yolo bypass, the Sutter bypass, the other engineered bypasses. And this would be a suggestion that they be more assertive in using those authorities to protect additional flood areas that receive heavy flood flows. An example that's been suggested has been the bottoms of the Cosumnes-McCollum confluence as it comes down into the North Delta, or the South Delta area that's between Manteca and Tracy, and then down towards the San Juan, towards Stockton.
Felicia.
How does this is just in addition to what we already have in the plan about specific floodways that we don't want encroached upon for both ecosystem and flood protection.
Yeah.
So this
Yeah,
is just
just
being
to
more
expand
assertive from
it
a flood protection point of view.
Yeah.
Good.
Don. I was trying to figure out from these items, including this one. This is a declaration that floodways and flood bypass systems are essential and currently underutilized. It is not the choosing of additional ones. We have in the Delta Plan the two that currently exist and one that we have identified in southern San Joaquin County for protected status. But this is going a little beyond that and saying the Central Valley Flood Board should upgrade its attention plate to floodplains. Since it's a recommendation and not a policy, at least that's my understanding, I'm inclined to believe that we don't do floodplains just because it's so bloody complicated to do and there's always objections and people want more money for their property and all of that. But I'm at least convinced, based on the scientific evidence and the engineering evidence we've seen, that if you want the fastest protection in a real emergency, to actually drop the river, the Yolo bypass, for example, with the Sacramento Weir and the Fremont Weir, is the single best thing we've got going to drop the river, 3 feet in so many hours, and nothing else will equal it in pressure. For me, it's really the notion of whether you wish to take flood bypasses, much like setback levees, give an elevated recognition to their value for a host of purposes as part of your overall plans.
Another way designated floodways could work would be to identify areas that are likely to have deep flooding should levees that we know are less than ideal fail, and so you would be using those authorities to prevent encroachment of additional development into those areas in a way that would increase liabilities. And it would require quite a bit of work by the flood board to understand how they would use those authorities. That's why they've been reluctant to do it, but it certainly seems like a possibility.
Well, is there the flood board, as you know from our presentation a couple of weeks ago, they've got their reconnaissance plan out, which isn't really a draft plan. It's a preliminary to a draft plan. And, I guess they might adopt a preliminary to a plan something by next year, but really the plan itself won't be done until 2017 at the earliest, if I heard everyone correctly. Since I think it's 1/3 of the statutory delta and or Suisun Marsh is within the jurisdiction of the Central Valley Flood Board also, does their probable delay in action constitute, in your professional judgments, reason why the Delta Plan should do one thing or another rather than just simply wait for these inevitable processes which seem to take generations to complete?
Well, I think my own point of view, I think those schedules are fortuitous because they would be completing their work with well thought through, thoroughly debated, recommendations about where levee improvements should actually occur and where bypasses should actually be expanded about the time we would be completing the next update of the Delta Plan. And so we would be able to, bring into that revised Delta Plan a really thorough and well thought out set of recommendations about additional flood control measures that would be part of the project in the Delta.
Correct.
And we could make recommendations to them now that would then fit into that additional planning as well.
You folks may know this. I have something nudging in the back of my mind that the Central Valley Flood Board, as with the previous Reclamation Board, has the power, acting on its own authority, to designate tentative flood bypass sites without completing all this complicated planning. Joe, I have that.
Well, their authority to designate floodways, which still, I think that they would need to have a reasonable basis for doing that. And
they do, and I don't think there's an exemption from CEQA.
Yeah. No, they would need to be considering CEQA, and certainly it's a restriction on the use of property, and so I think they would be very cautious in terms of making sure they had a good administrative record.
When you come back to us on this, check that issue. There is some status, I believe they were given by the legislature, to make some kind of protected designation. I don't know the details of it. I just don't remember. But that would be helpful. For example, if they have the existing authority to act, then our statement should be far more specific and direct. Utilizing your existing authority, the Central Valley Flood Board should, as opposed to we kind of hope they do maybe sometime as part of the plan.
Eric, do you know any more about this detail?
Yeah, I just don't remember.
Yeah, I'll check with the Flood Board.
Okay, that'd be great. Any questions on that? All right. How about the additional language you're suggesting in number 18? This is, I think you've added the Multi-Hazard Coordination Task Force. What was this all about? I mean, I read it, but
And actually have Eric walk us through this, since he's been the point person for it.
Yeah, this R10, if you recall, is the staff's recommendation proposing that the legislature create a regional flood risk assessment district. And I think some of the concerns that we had heard in comments were that the proposed district was perhaps just focusing on being granted powers relating to emergency preparedness and response and recovery activities. And I don't think that was the staff's original intention. And so we are adding new language that essentially we wanted to highlight the fact that this regional assessment district be granted fee authority by the legislature to assess beneficiaries in the delta of flood protection provided by the levees. And so that, I think, we're seeing is the primary responsibility of this proposed regional benefit assessment district. And then among other activities, they would include perhaps implementing some of the emergency preparedness and response actions that have been proposed by the SB 27 task force work. But I think we're reacting to the fact that some of the commenters were concerned that they weren't getting the fee assessment and beneficiary assessment aspect of this. So we're beefing up the language in both the narrative and the recommendation language itself to highlight that.
Current language already says fee assessment authority, including over state infrastructure. To provide adequate flood control protection and emergency relief. But that...
Well, apparently that didn't come through clear enough, so we're trying to make it a bit more clear.
Okay. What's number 19 about?
Okay. Well, this is, number 19 is a response to recommendations of a wide variety of groups. The Delta Protection Commission's proposal had very strong policy recommendations that agricultural land should be protected from ecosystem restoration and water management projects, as well as from urbanization. And we've seen the same thing in the language from the letters we received from San Joaquin County and from the environmental justice and fishing organizations that were working together on coalition letters. And so what we are proposing is that new policies that would be included in the final Delta plan, one in terms of both of these would be in the chapter about protecting the Delta as a place, because we've heard so often about how important agriculture is to it. And one would be that policy that would say that urban development, including commercial, residential, and industrial urban development, should be located inside existing cities or their spheres of influence or in the legacy communities, with an exemption for agricultural processing for local crops. Essentially what this would be doing would be expressing the council's policy that the agricultural areas that are outside cities or their spheres of influence or the legacy communities should remain in agriculture, except for where we have water management and ecosystem restoration projects that require locations in those areas, and that would be the second part of this, because what we recognize, and even though the Delta Protection Commission was uncomfortable with this implication, we recognize that there are times when ecosystem restoration projects or water management facilities are going to need to be located in existing agricultural lands, and so in that case, we would say that the water management and ecosystem restoration projects ought to avoid or minimize conflicts with existing or planned land uses. You'll recall that the Delta Protection Commission's proposal and some of the other levers suggested that those projects where they were inconsistent with local land use plans shouldn't be allowed to proceed. And really none of the local governments in the 5 counties have got local land use plans that would currently acknowledge those kinds of facilities. And so that would essentially give local governments the ability to block the water management or ecosystem restoration projects. So what we're suggesting in the case of those kind of actions that would affect land use plans, that we try to avoid conflicts where we can, minimize them where we can't, and then consider the comments that local agencies and the Delta Protection Commission make about ways to reduce those sorts of impacts. This might include, for example, one of the recommendations that was in one of the alternatives in the EIR, that buffers be created between restoration areas and adjacent agricultural lands. I think that was also a recommendation of San Joaquin County's letters. That's a good idea in some cases where it's feasible. The implication of it in some situations is it would mean if you don't have willing sellers, you end up having to condemn even more land to be able to create the buffer. And so I don't think we want to actually make that maybe the specific buffer requirement mandatory, but I think we want to make sure that proponents of these projects are consulting with local governments and with the Protection Commission. They're carefully considering their comments, and they're doing their best to minimize or avoid impacts. So that would be the proposals that we would make.
Don.
Dan, is there any consideration to, because again, you've heard from a variety of folks, not just from the Commission or from local entities regarding some of the sensitivities here, and I know that it goes to the heart of one of the co-equal goals, but from the standpoint of agricultural lands and conversion, oftentimes, and you mentioned this a moment ago, it's characterized in the urbanization category that you lose agricultural lands, but you can lose significant agricultural lands under even some current proposals that are out there, conversion from agriculture to habitat. And I guess my question is there, beyond taking those things in consideration, is there some thought about having, from a staff perspective, some not just local coordination, some local review? It may not be the sense is from the Commission, and certainly from the local communities, that they want to have the say-so. But as staff, assuming you don't agree with that, about having some other method or process in place that would require some concurrence at some level or some consensus. Otherwise, the agencies will do what the agencies do, and they have authorities and they have charges to do certain things under plans and adopted, other adopted plans. So I guess I'm kind of curious: was there any thought about, again, some other approach here besides just saying, well, we're going to acknowledge the role that folks have to put the habitat in place, and that's going to be that. We appreciate what folks say, so is staff looking at any other regarding this? Any other approach that might get closer to, I think, what concerns have been expressed both in the Commission's report, but also, I think, from a number of these entities?
We could develop that. I think our suggestion is that the proper approach is to consult with the local governments and with the Protection Commission to listen to their concerns, recognizing their voice for local residents, And certainly as part of the environmental evaluation process, that consultation occurs, that the project proponents then would be expected to, minimize or avoid conflicts, the maximum extent they could when feasible.
Felicia?
I'm just trying to understand. I understand Don's concern, I think, but I don't know if you're asking for a mechanism that allows the locality to block. If so, then we might as well not even bother.
Well, no, my question.
I just want to understand what you're asking for.
Well, at least in one county, I know they were considering a requirement of a use permit for the ecosystem habitat creation. The entity would come through and request that just you would for some certain other uses. Now, whether that went into place or not, I'm not sure. But I do know that as it relates to buffers, for example, and Dan used the example, well, if you require buffers, then you got to take more land. But I think the thought wasn't so much that, is that if you're going to, as a part of your restoration effort, that you put the buffer on your side of the fence, so to speak, on the habitat side of it, versus requiring the adjacent farmer or whatever the land uses are adjacent, that they accept, at least de facto being the buffer. And yet I understand the reality is what you say, because if you need X amount of land for habitat, and if you're going to provide the buffer, then you got to take more land. And I think that's the dilemma that folks are concerned about, at least in part, at the local level, is that encroachment then potentially on agricultural operations. Much of this can be compatible. I understand there's a lot of restoration activities that can be very compatible. Others that are not, though, particularly if you take areas and convert them to wetland habitat that are watered most of the year, if not all of the year, then that becomes very difficult to farm, and even to farm adjacent to in some cases. So I think from a local perspective, a lot of folks would like to have that block, to be very frank. But again, maybe there's some other approach here that, and maybe not. Maybe it's one of those where it's just a difference of opinion, and this council will have to decide, what's the best policy framework. And I understand that, but this is a big deal at the local level. It's a big deal certainly from a habitat standpoint and from the broader perspective, and I recognize that. But this is in conflict, and Dan and I sat together on the commission where we had some of these discussions about the land use and resource management plan, about policies there that gave ag preference over habitat in a number of cases because of the concerns that were expressed by the broader group of commissioners. So,
I think what I could do, actually, I had not thought of going back and looking at how we resolve that discussion in the land use and resource management plan, but it's certainly one approach that we could bring back among the alternatives would be to take that second policy, the one that would require water management or ecosystem restoration projects, to, among other things, consult with and consider the comments of local agencies in the DPC, and that you could add a provision to that policy that could require the project proponents to incorporate the measures that those local agencies recommended, unless they were infeasible or somehow incompatible with the purposes of the project. That would shift the burden a little bit to the agency that was rejecting the advice of the local entity, so that they would actually have to have a pretty good administrative record to blow off those kind of suggestions. But so we can look at that, and I'll see also how that was resolved. I believe in the DPC's land use and natural resource management plan, we gave the discretion to identify what ought to be the requirements of the buffer to the local ag commissioner, if I remember right.
Yeah.
Randy?
I won't speak to the urban uses of ag land conversion, but strictly from an ag policy point of view, I'm really eager to see what you come up with as a new policy statement or an amended policy statement, because as a practical matter, scientists tell us that they want more water habitat for fish. Well, the low value field crop acreage deep in the delta is too subsided to meet the scientists' criteria for good shallow water habitat. So that pushes us to the edge of the delta, where the vineyards and the orchards and the high value crops, the tomatoes and crops like that, are grown. And that's where seepage is the biggest problem. So you've got this conflict of the scientists telling us we need to convert ag land to shallow water habitat. You've got growers that have spent thousands of dollars developing this land with the plantings and the irrigation systems that could be impacted by seepage. So now at the council of the county governments telling us minimize the amount of ag land because of the location where this has to occur. You're actually, and you pointed out, you're going to need more for mitigation to address the seepage issues. So,
And certainly if a project is responsible for the seepage, you would imagine the affected property owners that weren't already compensated would have a reason to be, talking to the circuit judge about the damage that this project had done to their property. So I think in those cases, there's already a remedy where there's actual damage.
yeah, it's a very practical problem that I don't see any way to avoid the collision between, and then you add to that the loss of revenue, property tax revenue. There needs to be a connection with this policy with Chapter 5. And it needs to be made very clear.
That's the ecosystem chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Pat, did you want to weigh in on this? Okay. All right. Okay. Other questions? All right. I'm sorry, Dan.
The remaining recommendation that we've got to be on page 11 in terms of the policy language, and this was a recommendation that was highlighted by DPC's proposal, but also reflects many, many comments we received from local agencies in the Delta and from North Delta interests about the importance of.
Is this the one that you're going to propose that Supervisor Natoli remain a member of the council forever, and even if he retires from office, he retains that role? Is that good? Which I support personally.
And so one of the things that they've been arguing for, and it partly ties back, I think, to the issue about where the restoration projects and water management activities are, but also a concern that we would otherwise interfere in the details of local land use planning with our oversight roles of covered actions. They've been very clear that they don't want a bunch of duplicative rules and overlapping and inconsistent regulations. And so one way we thought we would try to respond to these comments and recognize the respect we have for local government's role in land use planning and the role of the Delta Protection Commission was to explicitly describe that in the plan. Right now, the plan doesn't acknowledge the local government's role in land use planning and the ways in which it's done. We thought we would do that in Chapter 8 and highlight the role that the statute gives to the Delta Protection Commission when projects come on appeal to the council, which is a process of referring to the Protection Commission those items and getting their advice back as part of our action. And so it's a way to be very explicit. Hey, we know you're doing this job. We've got some responsibilities of our own, including some oversight roles, but we recognize the work you're doing. And there is a way that you'll be included in decisions that the council makes, and that's in large part through the role the statute gives the Protection Commission.
Would you refer to any of the exemptions or other mechanisms in the statute that defer to local government for existing land uses?
Well, I thought the other thing we do, and I believe we talk about this maybe in the next section about the text, is one of the other suggestions.
You do in the process matrix.
That we're proposing is to reflect the sustainable community strategy for coordinating planning for urban development with the ecosystem and water management, natural resources planning.
I think that's cited earlier, right?
I think it's maybe later, but that was one of the items that we thought was another way to do that.
Matrix, I mean in draft 5.
I don't recall that being in there, frankly.
It's
in the statute for sure, and so to the extent that we've.
But isn't the statute cited in the?
Oh yeah, no, the statute is cited usually on the cover page of the chapter.
But it's not the whole statute, obviously. So it reflects the.
It would likely be cited in the governance section now, I think, because that would be where it's described as among the exemptions to the covered action process. I think we'd like to highlight it as also a way that we're coordinating our work with the planning of urban development, and a lot of folks have missed that limits the council's authority so significantly in areas of the secondary zone that are covered by sustainable community strategies.
Okay.
Well, so is this page 52? 2, is it?
You're looking at page 5 too, Pat?
Yeah, is that right? No, that's the,
No, that's the,
yeah. I read it yesterday, but now
let's hold that. Let's get through this stuff. Let's circle back and get an answer, if that's okay with you.
okay. I was really asking, in addition to that, I know what you're referring to there, where the new law authored by Senator Steinberg, right?
Yes.
Okay. For, the wiser planning,
Yeah.
reduction of greenhouse gases approach. But there are other exemptions too in the statute, right?
Certainly, yeah.
For projects that have already been entitled.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Projects that have vested rights, yeah.
So my
yeah.
question, maybe it's in the language, not in the subject matter, because it's not a change, but should we consider referencing some of those in the text in order to clarify for those local officials who perhaps have not read the statute closely? I'm thinking of a mayor of a big city south of here.
That makes sense to me that we should include that.
Would you like to explain, Supervisor Natoli, what he just said?
No, not at all. Let Pat explain it himself.
I just don't want to use the name. It's a good name.
Okay. Dan, anything else on this first matrix?
No.
Okay, members, look, it's 7 minutes after 11. I want to get to public comment by noon if we possibly can. The next matrix, table 2, is potential editing drafting. And hopefully we'll have comments, I suspect. But Cindy, if you would like to start walking us through this,
Sure.
Tell us what the comment was or summarize, and then how you plan to respond to it, and we'll go from there.
Okay. So starting with number 1, these were various comments received on the draft plan, as well as from the Independent Science Board and the Delta Protection Commission. In general, comment themes 1, 2, and 3 applied to various chapters in the 5th staff draft. The first comment theme that we put into the matrix had to do with comments regarding or concerns regarding the lack of cohesion, integration, and structure within the 5th staff draft plan. Staff agreed with many of the comments, and we are proposing the following changes to address these. So we're thinking of reorganizing chapters within the plan itself for better flow, better integration, additional text within the next draft that really highlights integration between major issues and between the different chapters. We are considering merging chapters 2 and 3 together to bring both the science, governance, and implementation together in one place. And we're thinking about doing this for a variety of reasons, and hopefully they'll become a little clearer as we go through some of the sections, including adaptive management. And then we're also looking from an editing standpoint to bring more consistency between the chapters. So again, better flow, better organization. People will know where to look for. The problem statements will be very clear. The context will be there. So again, just bringing sort of that cohesion and that picture together.
Okay. Felicia.
Yeah, as you know, most of my comments relate to this and the next point as well. So I think that all actually sounds great. I also hope that you are engaging a professional writer to make this one document rather than chapters written by separate people, which is fine for where we've been.
Yes.
But it definitely doesn't flow as a coherent story or narrative, which is what it needs to. So I'm hoping you're amping that up versus just reorganizing.
Right, and actually we've started down that path in terms of bringing some.
Great.
So.
Other questions, comments on this one? Okay, number 2.
Okay, number 2, comments. Key comments for this had to do with the fact concerns that the Delta Plan is not a plan, does not provide a framework or a process for near-term actions or priorities or over the next 88 years, so long-term. So staff looked at these. We agreed with many of the comments, and here are some of the proposed changes that we're bringing to you, including a more extensive discussion of how the Delta Plan functions as a plan and does provide framework for near and long-term actions, including a timeline as well in this next draft that indicates when major plans and projects will be completed and how those fit into implementation of the Delta Plan and its objectives, and more or better discussion and inclusion of specific objectives within the plan itself to kind of bring it full circle. So,
Felicia.
Great. A few other things I would add to that. I think the timeline and time frame is really important, short-term, medium-term, long-term actions. I also would say, as opposed to just having a better discussion about how the existing plan, this may be what you mean, how the existing plan functions as a plan, you got to amp it up to be a better plan. There need to be a lot more recommendations that flow together to make this really a plan, where people can see how if we implement the things we recommend, we will end up being in a better place. Because right now it's sort of it's odds and ends for it's a number of interesting recommendations, and you guys have done good work, but it doesn't hang together as a whole plan that takes us to the next level of awareness. So I'm just hoping that you'll also not just make what you've already suggested better, but suggest more things.
okay.
And maybe it would be helpful to me to have some examples of like that regard what's missing, because when I look at the plan and think about it in its reorganized format, of course I've had the advantage of trying to struggle with how that works, and you haven't seen it, but I see we have recommendations to complete the BDCP, which deals with two of the critical issues, conveyance and additional restoration. We'll have recommendations, I believe, about the ecosystem restoration projects that are already begun but not yet implemented, things like Dutch Slough or the Cosumnes-McCollum confluence. We have recommendations about how to create a more coherent plan for levee priorities. We're going to have recommendations about where agricultural land should be protected and for the protection of legacy communities. I believe we have already recommendations for completion of the storage studies in the headwaters areas. We've got policies that would talk about how water needs to be managed in a kind of delta service areas if people want to continue to be able to draw on delta water. So I don't see a big area where, hey, we're missing a set of recommendations. I see they're not maybe as well enough organized. We've got recommendations about here's water quality actions that need to be taken to protect the delta's water. So I don't see big gaps in the recommendations. I see they haven't been organized and articulated in a way that maybe there is apparent in the comprehensive nature of the plan isn't so evident. But if there are some additional areas where you're saying, hey, what about this, what about this, what about that, it would certainly be helpful to...
I have. I'll resend you my comments if
Okay.
you'd like, but I'll give you an example. Just because an issue is mentioned doesn't mean that's enough to explain. So I'll give you an example. As a result of some comments, we do say, do the storage investigations. And you, again, have the benefit of the next draft, which I hope will have a robust discussion about the role that storage plays in all of this, as opposed to it being absent, which it was pretty much in the fifth draft, even though we spent a lot of time in the white papers and beforehand talking about how the whole system works together. We're not laying out in the fifth draft the role that storage plays in all of this. BDCP is not dealing with storage for a variety of reasons. We don't talk about conveyance other than there's a conveyance discussion happening in BDCP. It's not everything about conveyance. There is now a little recommendation in there that says that DWR, I think, should recommend short-term fixes that can help make the system work better. And we don't really have a robust discussion about how to operate the system as a whole in a number of different places that can maximize the benefit to fish and other fish and water supply reliability, et cetera. So there are areas within the last draft even where we're just not even talking in a way that explains to the public who are going to be reading this what the issues are. And the example I like to give is if you look at the Delta Vision Task Force report or strategic plan, you get a sense of a picture of how the whole picture could work better. We're supposed to be way more advanced than the Delta Vision Task Force report. We're implementing that. We're implementing that vision. And there are a whole host of things in the fifth draft that don't get us to where the CalFed documents in 1990 explained how the whole system could work together better. So the fact that something's in there isn't what the point is. The point is that it's not robust, it doesn't fit together, it doesn't give a sense of how all of this could work better in the short run, let alone the long run. If you just wait for BDCP, once approved, it's going to take 15 years to build out whatever gets approved there, both on the ecosystem and on the... We should be talking about what do we do in the interim. We're not supposed to just twiddle our thumbs for 15 years. So there's just a whole bunch of those gaps in this plan. So it's not just, is it mentioned? It's, are we giving a compelling picture that's going to let legislators, the public, et cetera, feel like somebody is thinking about it and there is a way to get there. It's very complicated. I think what we're doing, as I said earlier, on adaptive management is incredibly important. It's really hard to figure out how you integrate that into the existing political and agency structure in a way that will work. We need a more robust discussion about how we're going to try and do that. I mean, this has got to take it another notch beyond the Delta Vision Task Force, and it's got to be a huge step beyond what we did in the 90s with CalFed. You asked, sorry.
Randy.
I concur 100%, and I would offer one suggestion. What's lacking in the fifth draft is a 50-year vision. We talk about all these components, but give the state of California a vision for what things can be like if done well 50 years from now. Make that a part of the introduction, make that a part of the introduction of each chapter, and then somehow show how the things are interlinked. The better cooperation among agencies, the time it takes to build adequate storage to add flexibility for dry year environmental supplies and more reliable water supply for the economy. Show how that all hangs together. It's a 90-year plan, obviously. That's going to be updated at least every 5 years. Let's use 50 years as our vision date, and every 5 years, update that. We push that 50-year vision and hold that out as a goal for how you make California a better place. That's what's lacking.
I want to weigh in. I agree with both Felicia's and Randy's comments. And if I had to guess, it's partially attributable to the fact that we haven't until recently had a common writer writing all of the chapters and trying to write it as one document, because the flow of the language doesn't quite work. Number two, because you are acutely conscious of the controversy all the statements make, sometimes we hide behind more polite statements than we actually should. And I'm in favor of plain speaking. But there are three things I would suggest for your consideration. I think one of the problems we've got is, I even hate to use the legal word, this is a programmatic environmental impact report as contrasted with a project environmental impact report. And I understand Mr. Stevens and I are guilty of being in the profession that forces these words on normal people. But nobody can understand the thing, because all the interest groups, they don't care about a programmatic impact. They want their priorities in there. And so they have insisted that their priorities, their specific projects, my project here, my project there, all be part of it. And because we say it's programmatic, but then we use the word project throughout because CEQA requires us to use it. A neutral person without skin in this game would read it with the same lack of understanding, because just the way we talk about the environmental impact reports and the designations of projects makes it obscure. I've always likened it to general plans of a city or a county which have legal impact but are not approving the specific projects at question. That may not be the right way to describe it, but I would urge you to wrestle with Mr. Stevens and his colleagues in an attempt to get past the legal configuration of the language to a way to explain that this is a broad policy document that is designed to lead the state and local agencies in complicated ways toward a better end over time. I think it's mentioned. I mean, you've got sentences and paragraphs in here that talk about it, but it's very legalistic, and there's a point where you need not the legalisms, but you need the overview. That's number one. Number two, Felicia and Randy made one very important comment that I want to reemphasize. Whether it's, you call it short-term actions, near-term actions, the fact of the matter is that many of these things won't happen until late in this century. And you've heard me say this many times here and in conversations with you. The legislature, the governor, and I believe the people of California are looking for a short-term list of actions that would happen. If BDCP moves as fast as it's humanly possible, construction will not be completed at the earliest until 2025. Ooh, what do we do in the meantime? Do we just hope there's no disaster, there's no earthquake, there's no interruption of supply, there's no levee failure from normal? I mean, and the answer is no, and we've spent some time on it. And I just think that part of this, whether it is part of the Delta Plan or a separate document, is the judgment of staff and the opinion of the council on what that near-term action package ought to be. And I hate to bore you all with it, but I'll say it. The 5 Delta water agencies, East Bay Mud and Contra Costa Water District, joined with MET and the state and federal water contractors to propose to the Department of Water Resources that they spend $163 million for agreed upon some kind of combination levee work, water reliability stuff in the Delta. Put aside the oddity of other people recommending the state spend its own money for projects that benefit them without a contribution. Put that aside. For the first time in this entire process, you had big voices saying, modest amount of money, and I know for real people, $163 million is not modest, but all the spending for government agencies in California on water and wastewater annually is over $20 billion a year. So $163 million is almost doable. And that's exactly the kind of discussion you want to promote in the next 50 years to get things done which don't wait the big political solution. So the near-term stuff, however it's phrased, to me is very, very important. Then the other thing is the more, and I highlighted, inclusion of more specific objectives. I think this relates to what Joe was talking about yesterday. Look, we've already got statutory language that says people ought to recapture stormwater. Is there any reason to have a goal or not having a goal? Having a planning target out there is at least telling you whether you're getting any change or not, as opposed to saying it's really a good idea and we certainly hope that people do it, and 100 years from now somebody will figure out whether they did or not. I just think that's all the changes you want to make are good, but I think you've got to deal with the confusion between programmatic and project EIR. You've got to do a near-term plan, and we have to do more on specific objects. So essentially setting a reasonable threshold that we expect the folks in California and the water world and the ecosystem world to cross over within the next 100 years. So that's mine on that point. Anything else? Done? No? Okay. Number 3, performance measures.
Right, performance measures. Comments we received regarding performance measures expressed concerns that they needed significant revisions. There were concerns about the language being vague or imprecise, lack of dates. So staff is taking a hard look at the performance measures that were in the 5th staff draft and providing dates and timelines for the administrative performance measures, refining the language for the driver and outcome measures that are currently included in the draft plan. And in addition, we are developing language to describe the process moving forward of further development of performance measures, specifically driver and outcome measures as we move forward, and using the implementation committee possibly as part of that process.
Felicia? No? I tried to add up all the performance measures of various types in the Delta plan, and I think I stopped when I got to 50. Just a couple observations.
Sure.
You've got categories. There are administrative performance measures, there are driver performance measures, and there are outcome performance measures. May I suggest to you that that's fine, but it doesn't, no reader makes sense out of it. I mean, particularly administrative is just process. We want the water board to complete a study by such a time. Did they do it? The driver, I mean, I don't even know what the driver is. I've read the definition, but I can't remember it. The outcome performance measures, on the other hand, are worth talking about because that has relate to real policy. Is the water system more reliable? Yes or no? Is the ecosystem improved? Yes or no? I am concerned about so many performance measures out there that we are incapable as an organization of monitoring them. So, for example, one of the ones typically is where you have year-to-year reports on fish species in the Delta. Okay. I understand the reports aren't consolidated and all that, and there are two different kinds of smelt calculations and reports. But you know, things like Randy's blog, one of his favorite blogs, the Fish Bio, and the folks over at the Davis Watershed Institute have managed to do over time reports on fish species. The real question for us is, if you include a performance measure, I personally expect the Delta Stewardship Council to immediately begin publishing information in an understandable format on that performance measure. And I think what you've done is include a lot of things where there is not currently available a source of information in a standard format that's available over time so you can get comparisons and you can grab a hold of it easily. And what we shouldn't do is overpromise all these things unless you think you can actually deliver it. And if you can't deliver it, that's terrific. Put one measure up on the website in 3 days so I can be satisfied that we at least have one out of all this list that we're capable of doing. You've heard me say that before too, right? So I think you've got to be careful on the performance measures, not to just get lost in the verbiage and have so many of them that we cannot adequately monitor and report. If you say the information's not available to do it, but this should be a performance measure, fine, take that out, go run with it. But I'd like to be able to read the plan and have at least some understanding what we're going to be monitoring immediately after the plan's adopted. If it's everything, that's okay. But you have to assure us that you have the capacity to do that.
And if we need other data sources and it's important enough, we should have a recommendation that those data sources be developed, right?
Oh, yeah, sure. And we do, in fact. We have a section on available information and needed information. But it's linking them together because performance measures, like everything else, tend to be everybody's idea of what might be a performance measure without thinking about how you work with it. And the scientists all tell us, look, it takes years to develop a performance measure, to execute it, and decades perhaps to monitor it. I just think we ought to be practical and careful about this.
I want to add some thoughts to the discussion here.
Yes, sir.
Performance measures are used in different ways. So the kinds of performance measures you're talking about are very useful in the public arena, and we need to have those. Those are absolutely critical for any system, and in the end, we probably need 5 or 6 things that we report on that are public performance measures that the public can understand, that the council can understand. It's also important that we have much more technical and more detailed performance measures for adaptive management purposes, so that because they are a part of that process of learning and modifying what we're doing and moving ahead. So, and I think that may be part of the problem. We include all of those things as performance measures, and that's confusing to people. And so we may need to think about what performance measures are the real public ones that people will judge the Delta by.
I think it's personally, I think it's outcome performance measures as a general preference. There are exceptions.
Yes, but I will say that we do need the other performance measures as part of the process of managing the system.
Comments, Gloria?
There's a statement where you've added a process to further development after the plan is adopted. I think that's really important to make sure there's some way that folks can still communicate about the adoption of the plan, even the fact of clarifying some of the issues of some of the sections in it. Also, I wanted to go back to kind of what Felicia and Randy said about the vision. I totally agree with there should be a vision, because the plan should really say to folks who looking for something to figure out what the state of California really wants to do regarding water policy. So I really think that vision statement is really important, as well as identifying some of the key issues in water, and then the vision, what we think the plan will do in terms of the state's commitment in the next 50 years. And then going back to Phil's point about near-term solutions, I think that's important. If we could put in the plan something we can do in the meantime, because BDCP will take until 2025, but what can the plan do in the meantime? Also, Felicia, I think, had recommended a professional writer. I think that's important because readability is an issue that Hank has always brought up, about someone should be able to pick up the plan who have some interest in water policy and read it and kind of understand it, because I think everyone should be interested in water policy in the sense of they can pick it up and say, this is important to everyone in the state of California. These are the key issues. This is the vision for the policy. And these are the components that we need to do in order to get there. For near-term solutions is real important. Vision is real important. Readability is important. And the process after the plan is adopted, by which folks can provide input and get clarification on the plan.
One of the challenges for us will be to connect, think through how we connect up the plan with our responsibilities under the Environmental Quality Act. Because certainly in identifying near-term solutions for projects that haven't yet completed their environmental evaluation, we'll have to be very careful about how we do that, so that we're not somehow undertaking the CEQA obligation for some other agency that's probably much better funded to do it than we are, or somehow prejudicing that later evaluation.
And by the way, you guys are doing a great job.
Well,
great job.
Yeah, it's not surprising why no state agency has ever had a plan for water or ecosystem ever. They've had various projects, but they've never had a plan. Deeply contentious and damn hard.
Can I just add one, and maybe we've already said that, but the co-equal goals, when you do that vision statement, I really think it should be part of, these are our co-equal goals, and so therefore this is the vision for those co-equal goals, because that's really what the plan is all about.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay. On to number 4.
Okay. Actually, I just wanted to quickly say that the staff have been taking a very hard look at Chapter 1 and thinking a lot about vision and vision statements. So,
by the way, I want to say there are a whole lot of pieces of Chapter 1 which actually work well in my judgment. I mean, Chapter 1 is not the problem, because remember, Hank, when you were saying you got to have an introduction or an executive summary or whatever we called it. What happened then is how you tie the substantive chapters to each other so they make sense,
right,
and integrate with each other,
yes,
connect. Yeah.
Okay, number 4 and number 5 have to do with adaptive management in the Delta Plan. The key comments we received in number 4 have to do with asking for a better description of how the adaptive management process that we propose in the draft plan is applied to the Delta Plan itself and the development of the Delta Plan. So what staff are suggesting that we do, and again, this comes with this suggestion of combining chapters 2 and 3, is to really, along with the adaptive management strategy and laying that out, but doing that in a way that we illustrate how that applies to the Delta plan and working through the 3 or the 9 steps and the 3 phases. So you'll see some differences there when we get to that point. And then in number 5, so that really is specific to chapter 2 and 3. There were also a series of comments we received regarding adaptive management, as well as identifying science needs and improvements in performance measures. And these were specific to chapters 4 through 8, so the policy chapter. So a common theme that there just needed to be better development of those sections within these chapters. And so staff have been looking at that and are hoping to provide clarification, additional language, and also add some examples of project-level adaptive management, applying the strategy at a project level so we could illustrate that as well, in addition to applying it to the Delta plan at a plan level. So,
Randy?
Much of what you just described was adding to. Have you considered subtracting from?
We have,
Good.
yes.
Good.
And there are some subtractions, and I gather the number of categories in some of the adaptive management discussions might be simplified.
Well, yeah, one thing we thought we would do now, I think the text describes a 9-step adaptive management process that takes place in 3 phases, and I think what we're going to describe is a 3-phase adaptive management process. It's got 9 steps.
What are the steps?
Do,
Plan,
do,
and
evaluate. Yeah.
I know this sounds idiotic, and that's what we were doing in basic training in the Army, but those kinds of descriptions are so much better.
Yeah, I think so.
That it's useful. The other thing, just a suggestion on adaptive management. If you go to the closing section of what's now Chapter 2, the effective governance for adaptive management, we call for it, but we don't quite say what it is. That seems to be the piece that's missing on adaptive management. Okay, as far as I can tell, all of our scientists and everybody says we don't know of an adaptive management in California water and the Delta ecosystem that looks all that good. Here's one we'd like to do. Okay, what does it look like? Now, not in the terms of its conceptual model for academics or for scientists. Procedurally, what does it look like? How do you bring together water management decisions and ecosystem management decisions? Do you just say, here's a method and each of you must independently apply it, and oh, by the way, the co-equal goals mean you have to pay attention to both of them? Or not? I think that's the hardest dilemma. The Independent Science Board is puzzled about exactly the same thing. Science program. To give some meat to this is, I'd love to see if you got an idea, what would it look like? And the super planner for our agency, Mr. Ray, what would it look like?
Well, in our Parks, our strategy was not to adapt to change, but to keep it where it is. So, of course, that's the reason I advised them to get out of the Delta, because I don't think they would be that effective in playing in this realm. It's not their approach. So I have to go back in my CalFed days and think about it, and Lauren knows why I didn't stay there very long. So it wasn't because I loved adaptive management. Then we're... Let's see, where are we? I think the next thing would be about the Delta as a place. I think when we bring back the plan to you, you'll see the Delta as a place chapter has been substantially revised. We've gotten great advice from the Delta Protection Commission. We've got the reports that Parks prepared, as well as a report from the Department of Agriculture and Food and Agriculture. And the DPC's done other great work with their National Heritage Area nomination, which is largely together now. So that's going to be substantially revised. It'll include a definition of what we mean by the Delta as an evolving place that we tested when we did our report on DPC's proposal, and try to tease out those special attributes that are unique about the Delta and that ought to be the focus of efforts to protect it as a place. And those, again, include agriculture, the legacy communities, the opportunities for outdoor recreation, and an economy that gives the Delta enough vitality that it can adapt to change and kind of roll with punches.
Randy, then Don.
Dan, you just said that one of the reports was the Department of Food and Ag, I think is what you meant. Is that the Dan Sumner report?
That was the report from the UC Davis
Yes.
Research
Yes.
Agency that submitted a report to Food Nag, yeah.
Okay, because that, it'll be interesting to see how you deal with that, because some of some of the things that come through in the ESP are in direct conflict with what Dan Sumner's findings were on the future enhancement of agriculture in the Delta.
It was, so I thought, sort of, when I read it, sort of a grim read that, people were doing what they could, and the future would largely be beyond their control.
As coming from the agricultural community, I couldn't find any criticism of Dr. Sumner's conclusions. And I think it's important to include some of those thoughts in the narrative, at least.
Don.
I just would thank certainly Dan for just the general comments here. I think that we'll wait and see what you come up with, but I do think that taking into consideration a myriad of comments, not just from the DPC, but I know the Conservancy's weighed in. I believe some of the landowners have weighed in, and other jurisdictions, and I think there's a good deal of information, and you referenced a good portion of that, Dan, in your comments, that they can really help to inform and to I think put a real good solid chapter together that relates to certainly the Delta as a place, but I think help people understand not only the challenges, but I think the things that are really treasures about the Delta and its communities and its people. So, and I guess the other thing I took away is that you're going to integrate some of this throughout the other chapters. Is that not just in Chapter 8, but that?
Well, I think an example of this will be the interplay between the discussion of ecosystem restoration areas in the chapter on ecosystem restoration, and then what we're saying about trying to protect agriculture where we can in the Delta. Or I think also another piece of it is in the agriculture sections of the Delta's place material. We anticipate talking about subsidences as a byproduct of past agricultural activities, and of course that interplays with the levy discussion. So I think we'll have those connections back and forth, and you'll see those really in every element of the plan now. I think we've worked really hard to provide integration across chapters and help folks see how actions in one place or conditions in one place are related to actions or conditions in another.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Other comments on this section? Okay.
I actually think we covered number 7 yesterday. This was a revised definitions.
Oh,
of
yes, we did.
So.
We did. Okay. Then number 8, please, the
Okay.
BDCP.
Number 8. So this is really a very quick laundry list of the concerns that we received, or comments, I should say.
Running the range of fully promise to do anything that comes out of BDCP, contrasted with reject anything that comes out of BDCP.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it.
So this is one where perhaps the next go-round we'll kind of list out. We'll do the list of the various comments and more specifics. At this point in time, staff agreed with many of the comments, and really what we're proposing to do now is to provide additional text in the 6th draft in terms of discussion with BDCP, locate that in appropriate chapters, the ecosystem restoration chapter and discussions that are pertinent there, the water supply reliability chapter, and we're not, in some of the cases with the comments, we're not really proposing to do anything at this point because we can't. I mean, we're waiting in some ways for the BDCP to be completed to come out. We have some discussion of that, but we're not, it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess, and we'll illustrate this a little bit better when we bring back the next matrix of how we're dealing with this long laundry list of concerns. But we at least wanted to get it out there today that this is one of those big ticket items we see.
Okay. Questions? All right. Number 9.
Okay, number 9, these, let's see, 9, 10, 11 have to do with flow-related comments. For number 9, we received comments that suggested Chapter 5, the ecosystem restoration chapter, was too flow-centric. So what we've done is we've moved in, and Lauren has been fabulous at revising the text and taking a look at ways to broaden the discussion of stressors. So it's not necessarily just primarily focused on flow. It's a broader discussion. Flow is still included in there, but so that's our proposal for addressing those concerns. Maybe I should move ahead. Should I just keep
Yeah,
going?
9, 10, and 11
Okay.
all relate to flow.
They do. And so 10 and 11 have to do with questions, comments, suggestions we got regarding the state board. And so number 10, we got some suggestions that maybe we should not encourage the state board to undergo this parallel development process of the flow objectives concurrent with the BDCP. We did not agree with that. And in talking with the state board, they're going to go ahead and continue to develop the objectives in conjunction with the BDCP. Yeah, so we just wanted to acknowledge there were concerns about this. So,
And explain
yes.
number 11. I didn't quite understand number 11.
So number 11, and maybe I might have Mark Bradley, who does not have a nameplate, so I'll have to say his name a couple times for the record, but he's really been our point person working on
That's
these
because we stole
particular.
them from the
That is,
water.
yes.
Right.
Yes. So.
Is this on?
It is, I believe
Okay.
it is on.
My name is Mark Bradley. The question was about some of the language that was used. We used the term in the text, flow standards. The recommendation uses flow objectives, and then uses the term flow criteria. As was mentioned earlier, all this is water quality objectives and water quality standards and the flow aspects of those. The Water Board has used the term flow objective, so it's become its own term of art. We have removed discussion of the flow criteria. The second part.
That was the special study language designated by the legislature to look at the environmental issues only in the Delta and come out with a flow criteria report they called for, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
to be consistent with the Water Board's terminology, we've backed off from that discussion of flow criteria.
Yeah, and that's because the Water Board's responsibilities are broader than just for the ecosystem.
Sure.
Yeah. And, okay.
And functionally, I mean, water quality criteria, flow criteria, this is developing kind of the scientific body of knowledge, and then that criteria gets considered in setting objectives. And the objectives are there to protect the beneficial uses, right? So you have the criteria that's developed somewhat, perhaps dispassionately, based on the evidence, and then a balancing happens when they move that criteria into objectives. And so we have tried to mirror that language and focus more on the language of objectives. We talked with the Water Board. We bumped up that second part, or we're recommending based on our discussions with the Water Board, bumping up that second part of that policy statement to say...
These are the tributaries language?
Yeah, to not develop criteria for those, but rather develop and implement as soon as possible the objectives for those. So that's an increase. The Water Board feels like they can attain that. It's reasonable and feasible. They feel like that's aggressive, those timelines, but they feel like that's better. So to address this inconsistency with the language issue, we have clarified that, and we're also proposing kind of a brief explanation sidebar piece that puts this in context for folks so they understand the process and understand the Water Board's terminology.
Mark, just on that point, if I might.
Yes, Chris, then Randy.
I'm sorry, Randy. There was in the previous chart, there was some language that was used that went to the flow issue, and I believe that's a little different than what you're describing here, so you may want to let the board, I appreciate the clarification as to what you're intending to go to, but if they turned back to that previous chart, it wouldn't match up with what you're saying. So
Understood. The essential difference is that we've tried to move away from this term flow criteria in those specific Water Board recommendations. And we've worked with them to use language that relates to flow objectives. So that's, I mean, for most people, it's not a giant difference, but it's a good consistency point for us.
Randy.
Mark, as it relates to the tributaries, do you anticipate the board would ultimately come out with recommendations for so many CFS based on hydrologic conditions for a type of year? Or would it rather be a percentage of unimpaired flow and then let everybody fight it out as to how much that would require in terms of CFS?
I mean, I really don't know. In talking with the Water Board, and Les Grover in particular, they're really trying to take a holistic approach with this. But I'm not sure they know exactly which direction they're going to go.
It's my understanding that they, at least at this point, may be headed towards a percentage of unimpaired flow. And the water users have opposed that. And the word that we've gotten back, some of the reports, some of the conversations I've had, is that that's not very scientific. And that there may be better ways to address that. That may be something that as we get into the sixth draft, we may want to consult with people that are on the ground dealing with these issues, both from the science standpoint as well as the water supply folks, and see if we might not want to offer some counsel as to what we think is the best way to approach that.
If I can add, as I mentioned previously, this is a big area of interest of our Delta Independent Science Board. And for the San Joaquin River flow objectives, they are proposing this percentage of unimpaired flow. And our Independent Science Board is also has some concerns about that. So I don't know the details of that yet, but I expect that they'll provide some of their insight in this memo.
And we're expecting that memo?
We are expecting the memo after their May 3rd and 4th meeting. So I think they will address that.
Oh, Felicia, I'm sorry.
Question. I've heard that you're maybe it's right or no, that you're going to change the discussion of stressors to include, flow. I mean, fish need water. They need their habitat and stressors, other stressors like toxics and water quality. So are you doing that? Are you going to be organizing it that way? I think that does make more sense optically as well as scientifically. So it gets to this point of us being able to articulate what does it really take to restore the ecosystem, and it's a mix of all three. On the flow issue, are you amping up or beefing up the conversation that Cliff had with us frequently about how flow isn't just, flow isn't just an overall number, it's also at what times, in what places, when the fish need it, so that you can use the water you use for fish objectives most economically. Are you able to work that in to the conversation?
Lauren's the author for that, Jeff.
Yes. The flow section was pretty short in Staff Draft 5, so we have added to that quite a bit, and we're absolutely emphasizing. Well, we had a kind of a little sidebar in Staff Draft 5 talking about those characteristics that Cliff would mention, so that's still there, but we definitely have augmented the text. And if I could just add what we now have 5 categories instead of 3. In Staff Draft 5, we had 3 categories: flow, habitat, and then we combined everything else into other threats and stresses. That third one went away. We still have flow and habitat, but what we've added is the environmental water quality, which we actually already had. It was just all in Chapter 6, and people didn't quite catch that. We had small little, please see Chapter 6 notes, but we noticed people didn't seem to catch that. So now it has its own heading. We still pretty much say it, but we give it its own heading. So environmental water quality, nutrient, which includes the nutrients, contaminants, all of that, salinity. Then we've added non-native invasive species as its own category. And then the 5th one is harvest and hatchery impacts. So those are our 5 categories of stressors that we're addressing.
Okay, other questions on this? Okay, then we're over to the finance plan and funding section, which is item number 12.
Okay, again, much like BDCP, this is a very short laundry list of quite a few comments, again, wide-ranging, but their concerns were expressed over and over again for a need for a clearer picture of the funding plan, the need for more funding for various elements of the Delta plan, and opposition to fees, and there were others that I probably did not capture in here. Many of the comments, when we looked at them, got us thinking that we weren't really going to necessarily be able to address them in the draft plan, but they would warrant a fully developed finance plan to flesh all of those out. So at this point, this is one it's a little bit in flux, but we've made some changes, or proposing to make some changes for Chapter 9 to move out some of the information into the appendices. It's a bit boiled down, I think, is where we've left it right now, but it's still up for discussion as to what stays and what goes within Chapter 9. But I think the key comments and concerns that we got were, gee, there were a lot of questions, there were a lot of requests for better definitions of things, and the way we're looking at it is those would be defined, they'd be better discussed in a fully developed finance plan. So that's...
And I think
I'm sorry, Randy.
the gist of our recommendation here is going to be that rather than try to develop a more complete finance plan as part of the next staff draft of the Delta plan, we're going to just include a provision that would call for a subsequent adoption of the plan, the development of a more detailed plan.
Yeah, that's good. I've given up on the thought that we could have a comprehensive finance plan by the time the Delta plan is adopted. But we continue to get the phraseology wrong. What we need instead of a funding plan is a spending plan. Let's figure out what we're going to spend the money on first, and then it will be obvious in most cases where the funding should come from and how to develop that plan. But it scares people, it alienates people, it makes people angry when we talk about sources of funds first. And we made that mistake from the first draft on, and we need to alter our approach. So in the sixth draft, I think what we need to do is to outline a process with the appropriate stakeholders and agencies involved to develop a wish list of expenses and projects. And then subsequent to that, develop a process to determine how to best fund those. That ought to be our, at least in terms of the way I view it, that ought to be what the finance plan consists of in the sixth draft.
I just ask
I'm sorry,
just
Felicia.
a couple quick questions. I just think this is hard, so I open to suggestions for what we do, either what Randy said or options or principles, et cetera. But I want to go back to the statute to be sure what it is. We were directed to do a finance plan. So the question is, how do we address whatever the exact language of the statute is, understanding the challenges. The second question is, and I know I just want to know this off the top of my head because I actually said yes to speaking about this fool that I am sometime next month. So will you remind me who our chief staff person on this is?
Yeah.
Kurt
Miller.
Right, Kurt Miller.
Oh, Kurt, perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, Joe.
I want to add one of the things that we're doing, and it's something I've talked with the Vice Chair about before. We are planning to add a section that tries to outline, in some cases we don't know what the costs are, but in many cases we actually do have an estimate. So we will have a section that lays out in a spreadsheet, I think we're planning to put it in as an appendix, all of the potential expenses so that we actually have some place to begin moving ahead. And I think that is a fundamentally important thing to do, actually lay out what the needs are so that you can, from there, work to say, well, who is responsible for this? And we will do that to the extent we know who's responsible. We'll say, this is DWR that's responsible, or this is a local agency, or it's a federal agency, whoever it is. In some cases, we will have blanks, and those are the challenges, and that's important in the plan to actually identify what the needs are and then what the holes are. So,
I agree with that. I hope you are not, however, dropping the reference to beneficiary pays and stressor pays. I understand everyone's in favor of financing and no one's in favor of paying, but I don't want to lose the practical implication that money is not endless and beneficiaries have to pay and people who harm the system have to pay. And unpopular as that may be, if you don't have that continuing as a concept within the plan. You don't have a financing plan. You just have a wish list that you hope somebody gives you money to do.
Those remain.
Yeah. Okay, other comments on this? All right. Joe, I have one last suggestion, Dan. At some point, and maybe next week is the right time, I want you to walk through all the charts and the graphics with us for evaluation. And let me just, some of these are technical points, but some of them are more than technical. I'll give you a couple examples. On page 22, you have a list of agencies with responsibilities in the Delta. They're largely local and federal. What's missing?
I assume you're not asking the question now.
Well, I'm just telling you, the Delta Stewardship Council's not there. Perhaps is implicit and understood, but it's kind of odd. That's a technical one. But on page 25, which is a very interesting chart about summary of anticipated changes affecting the Delta by 2050 and 2100, kind of the stuff that Felicia and Randy were talking about. You know, I look at that and I say, wow, that's really an interesting chart. It estimates a possible population increase in California. It estimates it brings together probability of earthquakes, island flooding. It's one of those charts. It's not a great chart. As a matter of fact, it's not a chart. It's a table. But it's remarkably interesting information, not fully developed and not presented in a way that's easier to understand. And that, for me, since I think the charts and the tables are almost as important, if not more important, than the narrative, I want an occasion to walk through this and also ask about whether there are things in the Delta Plan as presently configured that need additional graphic presentation. I mean, for example, we talk about flows endlessly. We do not have graphic representation clearly of Delta inflows, Delta exports, and Delta flows going to the ocean over time.
I guess I understand the importance you attach to these, but I guess I'd ask your patience and let us bring that back to you at a subsequent meeting rather than just in a couple of weeks. One of the things that we're doing now is we compile the sixth draft. Is we're going through and we've tasked each author as well as our editor to identify.
Pick a meeting.
Okay.
No, tell me what a meeting, because Pat's going to write it down in the minutes, and because I know this is my pet peeve, and members, if you don't want to indulge me, that's fine. But we put this one off to the last because it's not as important, I suppose.
Mr. Chair,
yes, sir.
We will do this. You mentioned this to me the other day, and I know you don't realize I actually listened. I already talked to staff about preparing this.
Oh, you always listen. You always listen.
So we're working on it, and my hope is that we could bring it back well, let me check with staff. I don't want to commit. My hope would be that we could bring it back in April, but depends partly on what happens next week and how difficult it is to get the next draft done. But we are aware of it, and we will come back with an agenda item where we go through all of the charts and all of the graphics in the plan and really take our time walking through that with the council. Because I think you're right. Those are the things people remember and use. I have, in my career, many times pulled a chart or a graphic from somebody else's document and used it when I've given a presentation. So to the extent that we can do that well, maybe people will use those in their discussions in the future.
Okay.